The sky above the Philippine Sea burned like a furnace. Black smoke coiled upward from the wreckage of ships, their decks aflame, while the distant thunder of explosions rolled across the water like an endless drumbeat. The sea, normally a deep, calm blue, was streaked with oil and debris. Life rafts bobbed among the waves, surrounded by the wreckage of aircraft that had once defended the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrow, standing on the flight deck of the USS Lexington, watched another column of smoke rise on the horizon. It wasn't the first ship hit today, and it wouldn't be the last. Kamikaze, someone shouted from the bridge. The word was still new to most sailors, but its meaning was already understood far too well. Pilots who didn't come to fight, only to die. From high above, Japanese Zeros appeared as distant black dots descending through the blinding sun. Their engines screamed in a steady, unwavering dive, and not one of them broke formation. "Get those Hellcats airborne," Morrow barked into the radio, his voice drowned by the roar of engines and the shattering boom of anti-aircraft guns. Shells exploded in the air like angry fireflies, but the Japanese pilots kept coming. A single Zero, trailing smoke, plunged straight into the deck of a destroyer off the port side. The impact tore the ship open, throwing men and metal skyward. The explosion hit Morrow in the chest like a hammer. He could feel the heat even from hundreds of yards away. For a moment time froze, the sound, the heat, the light, everything fused into one terrible instant. Then came the screams. The Lexington's crew worked like men possessed, rearming, refueling, and launching what fighters they could. The horizon was a wall of incoming planes. There was no room for fear, no time for hesitation, only action. In Tokyo, in a darkened underground bunker lined with maps and cigarette smoke, Vice Admiral Madome Ugaki looked over the reports from the previous week's attacks. His eyes were hollow from exhaustion. 89 planes and 78 failed to return, his adjutant read aloud. Confirmed hits, 4 ships sunk, 7 damaged. Ugaki closed his eyes and whispered, 78 spirits ascended to the Emperor. He knew what those numbers meant. Japan was running out of pilots and out of fuel, but he also knew that desperate men could achieve what logic denied. The Suicide Corps, the special attack units, had become the Empire's final weapon. "They will not stop us," Ugaki said quietly. "They may shoot down 1, 2, even 50 of our planes, but one will always get through." Back aboard the Lexington, Morrow and his radar officer, Ensign Tom Blanchard, studied a flickering green screen deep within the Combat Information Center. Blips moved across the phosphorescent glow, fast, erratic, and many. 40, maybe 50 bogies, bearing 170, Blanchard said. Altitude 15,000 and dropping. Morrow's jaw clenched. They're coming for the fleet. He slammed the intercom switch. Launch every available fighter. Tell the destroyers to open their fire control radars. We're going to need every eye we've got. As he spoke, an idea began forming in his mind, something no manual or admiral had ever taught. It came from sheer necessity. What if every ship, every radar, every airborne fighter could be linked in one system? A living net in the sky, watching from horizon to horizon. At that moment, it was just a dream, but it would soon become the weapon that saved them all. The kamikazes came in waves. The first slammed into the bunker hill, detonating a full bomb magazine. The shockwave rippled through the ocean. Sailors on nearby ships dropped to their knees as burning debris rained down from the sky. The second hit the San Jacinto, then the Enterprise. The Pacific Fleet was bleeding, fast. Morrow raced to the flight line, shouting orders. "Get those Hellcats in the air. Don't wait for clearance." Pilots sprinted to their planes, their faces smeared with oil and sweat. They had seen what happened when a kamikaze got through. Up above, the sky became a swirling nightmare of gunfire and vapor trails. Morrow's pilots, young men barely out of high school, fought with desperation. "Angel 1 to base. There's too many of them. They're diving straight through flak." "Keep your eyes open, Angel 2, Morrow shouted back. "Don't get tunnel vision." He could hear the panic, the ragged breathing, and then the silence when another voice was gone. 1-0 after another disintegrated in bursts of flame, but enough got through to strike another destroyer, then another. Each hit felt like a gut punch to everyone on the radio net. By the time night fell, the sea was a graveyard of ships, smoke rising like funeral pyres across the horizon. Morrow sat alone in his cabin, the hum of the ship's generators the only sound. His logbook lay open before him. Day 12 of the Philippine campaign. The enemy doesn't fear death. We can't fight men who don't come home, unless... He stopped writing. The idea returned, the one that had sparked hours earlier in the CIC. What if radar wasn't just a tool for detection, but the backbone of an entire defense network? He flipped open a chart and began sketching. Circles, arcs, and lines across the sea. Each ship had a radar range. If those circles overlapped, if data could be shared in real time, then maybe, just maybe, they could intercept suicide planes before they reached the fleet. A combat air patrol, not over one ship but over every ship. A moving, breathing net of fighters, all connected by radio and radar. Morrow didn't know it yet, but he was outlining the birth of the Combat Air Patrol Network, the system that would save thousands of lives and turn the tide of the Pacific Air War. The next morning brought no peace. The sun rose red and furious, as if reflecting the blood in the sea. The fleet moved slowly eastward, limping toward Leyte Gulf. Below decks, Blanchard worked frantically with the radar technicians. "Sir, I think we can link the frequencies across the destroyer line," he explained. "If we coordinate sweep sectors, we'll get early warning by almost 40 miles. Morrow nodded. "Do it. We'll vector our fighters to those coordinates before the kamikazes even see us." By noon, a crude version of the system was in place. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Each radar operator relayed contacts to a central plotting board, where coordinates were updated in grease pencil faster than anyone had thought possible. And then, just after 1,300 hours, the test came. Multiple bogies, heading 95, speed 250 knots, altitude 12,000, Blanchard called out. Morrow keyed his mic. "Angel Flight, this is base. Intercept Vector 95, Angels 12, you're cleared hot." High above, 8 Hellcats banked eastward in tight formation. The ocean glittered beneath them like glass. Minutes later, their radios crackled with the unmistakable urgency of contact. Visual on bandits, 30+, heading straight for the task force. "Engage, break them up before they reach the line." The sky erupted in a violent dance of tracers and smoke trails. The Hellcats slashed through the incoming formation, cutting down kamikazes before they could even begin their dives. One by one, the enemy planes disintegrated mid-air, their engines trailing black ribbons of smoke into the sea. Down below, radar screens lit up like fireworks, but this time, the blips vanished long before they reached the fleet. On the bridge, Morrow gripped the railing as the reports came in. 11 bandits destroyed, no hits on the fleet. Repeat, no hits on the fleet. For the first time in weeks, there was silence, blessed silence over the radio. He exhaled slowly, the weight of 100 sleepless hours falling from his shoulders. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually stopped them." That night, as the fleet steamed onward under the watchful eyes of the stars, Morrow stood alone on deck. The wind carried the scent of fuel, salt, and burnt metal. He knew this was just the beginning. The kamikazes would come again, stronger, more desperate. But now they had a shield. The Combat Air Patrol Network would evolve, spread across the Pacific. And by the time the fleet reached Okinawa, it would be the most advanced air defense system the world had ever seen. But for now, under that vast, indifferent sky, one exhausted commander allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Somewhere in the darkness, the next battle was already forming, but at least now they had a fighting chance. The next dawn bled across the horizon in streaks of gray and gold, revealing a fleet scarred but unbroken. Smoke still curled from the twisted hulls of ships that hadn't made it through the previous day. The ocean, slick with oil and debris, glistened like black glass. On the USS Lexington, Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrow leaned over the plotting table in the Combat Information Center, a mug of coffee untouched beside him. His eyes were red and sunken. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. Around him, a dozen officers spoke in hurried bursts, relaying radar contacts, checking bearings, scribbling updates. The radar blips danced across the phosphor screen, each pulse a heartbeat of the Pacific War. Morrow wasn't looking at the blips anymore. He was seeing connections. "If we overlap the sweep zones," he said, tracing circles across the map, "we can turn this into a live net. No more ships acting blind. If one destroyer spots them, we all see them." Ensign Tom Blanchard, his young radar tech, nodded. "Sir, it'll take some coordination, frequencies, synchronization intervals." "Then we start here," Morrow cut in. "We'll do it with what we have. No new equipment, just brains and courage." A pause. One of the older officers, Commander Hensley, frowned. "You're talking about turning the fleet into a single radar organism, Jack. That's science fiction." Morrow looked up, exhaustion sharpened into defiance. "It's the only way we live through Okinawa." That afternoon, Admiral Raymond Spruance arrived by radio from the Indianapolis. His message was brief. "Expect large-scale kamikaze strikes. Intelligence believes the Japanese have organized full suicide wings." Morrow read it aloud to his officers. The room fell silent except for the hum of the radar. Blanchard muttered under his breath, "They're not even pretending anymore. They're just sending men to die." Morrow folded the message and looked around the table. "Then we make sure they die far away from our ships." 2 days later, off Okinawa. The Combat Air Patrol network was alive, barely. It was held together by improvised wiring, half-broken radios, and the stubborn will of men who refused to drown. Every destroyer, cruiser, and carrier in the group had a radar sector. Operators called them spokes, radiating outward from the fleet like a great wheel. When one ship detected a contact, its coordinates were radioed instantly to a central plotting board on the Lexington, where Morrow's team updated a massive wall map in real time. It was crude, it was chaotic, but it worked. At 9:40 hours, Blanchard's voice cracked over the intercom. "Multiple returns, bearing 210, fast movers, altitude 12,000, range 40 miles and closing." The CIC erupted into motion. "Vector Angels to intercept," Morrow barked. "Get any fighter in the air." Above deck, pilots sprinted to their planes. Engines roared to life, propellers blurring into silver discs. The flight deck crew ducked under the swirling wind as F-6F Hellcats leapt skyward, climbing into the sun. Through the static-laced radio, Morrow could hear their voices, young, tense, but steady. "Angel 1 airborne. Angel 2 airborne. Forming up on intercept course." The radar returns moved closer, 50, 45, 35 miles. Then suddenly split echoes. Blanchard's face tightened. "They're breaking formation. Looks like decoys, sir. 2 groups diverging." Morrow's heart thudded. The Japanese were adapting, sending false targets to draw off the CAP, while the real kamikazes came in low. He snatched the microphone. "Angel Flight, this is Lexington. Break formation. Half your wing drop to Angels 5, search for low flyers. They're trying to sneak under radar coverage." "Roger that." Seconds stretched like hours. Sweat beaded on Morrow's temple as the green traces shifted across the radar screen. Then, new blips, very low, closing fast. "Contact, 25 aircraft at 3,000 feet. "Those are the ones," Morrow shouted. "Vector Intercept Grid Bravo 7. Above the fleet, the Hellcats caught sight of the enemy, a formation of Japanese Zeros flying just above the waves, sunlight glinting off their canopies. Behind them, long white plumes marked the spray of their wingtips cutting the water. Angel lead tally-ho. The Americans dove. Machine guns thundered, tracers stitching across the ocean. Zeros burst into flame, some exploding midair, others plunging into the sea in smoking spirals. From the bridge of the Lexington, sailors cheered as distant blossoms of fire lit the horizon. But the celebration died as new radar echoes appeared, smaller, faster, higher. Blanchard cursed, "They're coming in from the north now." Morrow grabbed the mic again. "Scramble reserve flight, all guns stand ready." He turned to Hensley. "We're fighting a chess game against ghosts, Commander. They're attacking from every angle." "And you're outnumbered," Hensley said grimly. "Maybe," Morrow replied, "but for the first time we can see them coming." The attack lasted less than 30 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The Lexington's deck guns spat fire into the sky. Radar operators shouted coordinates like auctioneers. Pilots screamed warnings over static-filled radios. When the smoke finally cleared, 17 Japanese planes had been destroyed. Only one ship, a destroyer, had taken a hit. Morrow stood by the plotting table, staring at the dozens of chalk marks that now covered the wall. The system had worked. The fleet was bruised, but alive. For the first time since Leyte, the kamikazes hadn't broken through. That evening, Admiral Spruance's message came through. Network system proved effective. Recommend immediate integration fleet-wide. Well done, Lexington. The room erupted in applause and relieved laughter. Blanchard leaned against the table, grinning like a kid. "Sir, we actually did it. We made a net that holds." Morrow smiled faintly. "Don't celebrate yet, son. This was just the first storm. They'll learn just like we did." He looked through the porthole, out at the dying sun glowing across the Pacific. Beneath the beauty of it, he saw ghosts, burning planes, screaming pilots, the faces of men who never made it back. War wasn't about who invented the smartest machine. It was about who could adapt faster, who could outthink death itself. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the next wave of kamikazes was already forming. That night the CIC stayed awake. They refined radar overlap, adjusted frequencies, synchronized bearing calls. Blanchard reworked the plotting system, turning grease-pencil chaos into an elegant lattice of geometry. "Sir," he said at one point, "do you ever think about the men flying those Zeros?" Morrow paused. "Every damn minute." "They know they're going to die," Blanchard said softly, "and they fly anyway." Morrow's voice was heavy. "That's what makes them dangerous, but it's also what makes them beatable, because death is all they have left to give. We're fighting for more than that, for home." By morning, the air net had a name. Not officially, just what the crew called it. They painted the phrase on a piece of scrap metal and bolted it above the plotting board. The net never sleeps. When the next Japanese strike came, 2 days later, the system caught it before a single Zero even saw the fleet. Fighters scrambled early, intercepted high, and the sky was filled with thunder long before the enemy could reach their targets. By dusk, the fleet was untouched. Morrow walked the deck alone, the wind whipping at his jacket. The horizon was quiet for the first time in days. Blanchard joined him, holding a clipboard. "Sir, we've logged the data. Range detection's up by 40%. We've outflown them, outgunned them. Hell, maybe even outthought them." Morrow looked toward the east, where the sun was setting behind the smoke of distant fires. "Don't get too proud, Ensign. War has a way of humbling you the second you think you've won." He turned away, his face half in shadow. "But maybe, just maybe, we've changed how it's fought." By the time April rolled in, the Pacific had turned into a furnace. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. The horizon was a dirty gray smear that smelled like gasoline and salt. The Lexington's decks were stained with black streaks of burned aviation fuel, and every man aboard had the look of someone who hadn't truly slept in weeks. Beneath that exhaustion, though, something like pride had begun to grow. The air net worked, and everyone knew it. For a moment, they believed they'd found the secret to beating the unstoppable. But war has a cruel habit of listening. The first sign came one moonless night when the radar suddenly lit up with dozens of new contacts, fast-moving, clustered, and low. 30 bogies bearing 085, Blanchard shouted over the hum of the equipment. The CIC burst into motion, scrambling fighters, alerting gun crews, calling every man to his post. Yet when the Hellcats reached the intercept zone, there was nothing. No planes, no shadows, only ocean and fog. "Sir," Blanchard whispered, staring at the screen as the echoes flickered and vanished. "They just disappeared." Morrow frowned, leaning over the radar. The blips had been too organized to be noise. "It's not malfunction," he said quietly. "It's deception." "Deception?" Morrow nodded. "They're learning. Maybe they're bouncing our radar off clouds or metal foil. Or maybe," he paused, watching a faint trace appear and fade again, "maybe they're ghosts." 2 nights later, those ghosts came back, this time during a refueling operation. A cluster of ships sat vulnerable, hoses stretched across decks, the smell of diesel thick in the air. The radar blared again, multiple inbound signatures. Pilots scrambled instantly, engines howling in the dark. But again, nothing. No targets. The sky was empty. Then, without warning, a lone Zero dropped out of a cloud, diving straight for the tanker Missouri Star. Alarms screamed, tracers arced upward, and the plane exploded in a flash that turned the night white. The tanker burned for hours, her fire a pillar of smoke that could be seen 50 miles away. The crew's confidence shattered overnight. "Sir," Blanchard said the next morning, eyes hollow, "they're using the weather against us. Every time the radar flares up, the men jump. They're afraid of ghosts." Morrow didn't answer at first. He stared at the ocean outside the porthole, the waves calm and deceitful. "Then we teach them how to hunt ghosts." Over the next week, Morrow's team changed everything. They retuned the radar frequencies to cut through static interference. They used overlapping sweeps from destroyers to filter false echoes. And most importantly, they began using acoustic triangulation, the simplest, most desperate innovation of all. When radar failed, they'd listen. They wired microphones and sonar pickups together, mapping the distinct hum of aircraft engines across the water. It was primitive, fragile, and dangerous, but it worked. During one tense dawn, a low, distant buzz reached the array. "Contact bearing 150, altitude unknown," Blanchard reported. Morrow leaned in. "Confirm acoustic trace." A petty officer turned a dial, isolating the sound. It was faint but rhythmic, the throaty roar of Nakajima engines. "They're coming," Morrow said softly, "and this time we hear them before they see us." Minutes later, Hellcats intercepted the incoming formation over the ocean, catching the kamikazes before they could dive. It was brutal, fast, and decisive. The ghosts bled back into the sea. But even as the air net evolved, the strain on the men grew heavier. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and guilt gnawed at them. The radar room became their prison, dim green light, cigarette smoke, and the constant mechanical heartbeat of the scopes. Blanchard began talking to the radar. "You can't hide from us," he'd whisper to the screen, tracing blips with his finger. "We see you, we hear you." Morrow caught him once and said gently, "Don't let it get to you, son." Blanchard laughed, a dry, nervous sound. "It's already in my dreams, sir. The blips keep moving even when I close my eyes." One evening, during a brief lull, Morrow found a letter tucked under his coffee mug. It was from Blanchard. "Sir, sometimes I wonder if we're becoming the machines we built. The radar doesn't sleep, and neither do we. Maybe the ghosts aren't out there. Maybe they're us." Morrow folded the note, said nothing, and kept it in his pocket. The Japanese adapted again. They began sending small decoy squadrons, timing them to distract the air net while main waves slipped in from other directions. Worse, they started flying at night, cutting engines to glide silently toward their targets before igniting them at the last second, a suicide tactic within a suicide mission. April 28th became a night no one aboard the Lexington would forget. Radar pings echoed like raindrops, 20, 30, 40 bogeys, but the signals were erratic, flickering on and off. "Something's wrong," Blanchard said, voice tight. "I can't lock their altitude." "Launch Intercept," Morrow ordered. Up above, the black sky came alive with tracers. Pilots chased invisible enemies through clouds, guided only by the glow of their instruments and the lightning of anti-aircraft fire. Then, silence. A Zero cut its engine and dove out of the darkness, its fuselage already on fire. It hit the carrier San Jacinto amidships, tearing through the flight deck like paper. The explosion rocked the entire task force. Men were thrown from their bunks. Morrow steadied himself against the plotting table, heart hammering. "Get damage reports," he shouted. Blanchard slammed his fist on the console. "They're inside the net, sir. They found the gaps." By morning, the smoke still hung low over the fleet. Rescue boats combed the water for survivors. Morrow gathered his officers in the CIC. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, he said, "We built a wall of light and they slipped through the dark, but we're not beaten. We adapt again." Commander Hensley sighed. "We're out of ideas, Jack. What else can we build?" Morrow pointed to the radar. "We don't build machines, we build men. Every pilot, every operator, every watch on every ship, they become part of the same heartbeat. The net isn't steel or wire, it's us." That afternoon, he gave the order to rotate shifts in shorter bursts. No one worked more than 4 hours without rest. He reassigned radar techs to flight decks for short stints, so they'd remember what the fight looked like outside the screens. He even ordered chaplains to visit the CIC, just to remind the men they weren't ghosts themselves. The transformation was slow but steady. The air net wasn't just a network of machines anymore. It became a living, breathing system of humans and technology, united by survival. When the next kamikaze wave came, a massive strike of over 200 planes, they were ready. Radar detected the first contact 90 miles out. Acoustic sensors confirmed engine noise 40 minutes later. Fighters launched in waves, guided by live voice links between radar stations and cockpit radios. The Japanese pilots came fast and furious, screaming through the clouds in burning dives, but the interceptors were already waiting. The sky erupted in chaotic beauty, explosions, streaks of light and black smoke curling in the sun. On the Lexington, sailors cheered as one Zero after another fell short, plunging harmlessly into the sea. The fleet remained intact. The air net had held. That night, as the ocean glowed faintly with burning wreckage, Blanchard stood beside Morrow on deck. "Sir," he said quietly, "do you think this ends soon?" Morrow didn't answer right away. The horizon was still flickering with distant fires. "No," he said finally, "but I think we just proved something to the world. You can throw men into the sky to die for your empire, but you can't outfight an idea." Blanchard looked at him curiously. "An idea?" Morrow nodded. "The idea that if you link enough hearts, enough minds, enough courage, you can build something stronger than fear." He glanced up at the stars, their faint reflections shimmering on the water. "That's what this net really is. It's not a defense grid, it's faith made visible." And as the night carried the scent of burned oil and salt across the quiet sea, both men stood in silence, watching the horizon for ghosts that might never come again. By mid-April 1945, the skis over Okinawa had turned into a storm of steel and fire. The Japanese called their final Operation Tengo, Heavenly Operation, a last-ditch effort to hurl every remaining aircraft, trained or not, into the American fleet. Nearly 1,500 planes were committed, many of them piloted by barely trained youths who'd been told they were divine thunderbolts. The men aboard the carriers Bunker Hill, Essex, and Enterprise had other names for it: Hell on Earth. From dawn to dusk, combat air patrols, CAPs, churned into the air, circling high above the fleet in tight orbits. Each CAP team was the thin line between survival and destruction. Radar operators tracked blips, fighter directors barked orders over radio, and pilots strained their eyes against the glare of the sun. On the Bunker Hill, Ensign Jerry Collins sat in the cramped CIC, Combat Information Center, headphones pressed to his ears. Sweat beaded under his flight helmet. The radar screen bloomed with movement, tiny echoes crawling in from the north. "Contact 25 miles, Angels 5, he called. "Speed fast, could be them." The voice of the fighter director officer came sharp. "Vector 32 CAPs to Intercept. Go get M." High above in his F-6F Hellcat, Lieutenant Red Harrison grinned grimly. "Copy that, Control. Angels 10, Vector 320. Let's go hunting, boys." His squadron throttled up, the deep-throated roar of Pratt and Whitney engines filling the heavens. Below them, sunlight glinted off the waves like shattered glass. And far beyond, dots appeared on the horizon, dark and steady, coming straight in. "Bandits confirmed," Harrison said, voice tight. "They're not even weaving. God help us, they're coming in straight." The kamikazes weren't flying like fighters. They were flying like missiles. Straight lines, full throttle, pure intent. "Take the left group, I'll handle the right," Harrison barked, diving hard. His Hellcat's wings shuddered as he lined up the lead zero in his sights. The Japanese pilot didn't flinch, didn't even try to evade. The 6.50 caliber guns opened fire, tracers ripping through the sky. The Zero exploded in a white flash, debris scattering across the clouds. But even as it fell, another dived past him, arrowing toward the fleet below. "Control, one broke through," Harrison shouted. "Roger, inner CAP engage," came the reply. Below, another ring of fighters scrambled to intercept. Every layer mattered. The outer CAP intercepted first contact. The inner CAP caught what slipped through. And if both failed, it was up to the ship's gunners to finish the job. From the decks of destroyers and cruisers, sailors pointed skyward, yelling warnings. The klaxons screamed. Air raid, all hands to battle stations." Anti-aircraft guns erupted, 40 Bofors chattering, 20 Oerlikons blazing. Black puffs of flak burst across the sky. One kamikaze broke through the defensive screen, diving straight at the Bunker Hill. The gunners opened up, the entire ship shaking from recoil. "Keep firing," screamed Chief Gunner Miller, his hands raw from heat. "Keep that bastard out of our deck." The Zero burst into flames, trailing smoke, but its momentum didn't die. It crashed just 50 yards off the port bow, sending a geyser of water over the flight deck. The shockwave rattled teeth. "Too damn close," Miller gasped. But there was no time to breathe. Another wave was inbound, 50 planes this time. Back in the air, Harrison's squadron was down to half fuel and half ammo. He gritted his teeth. "We're staying up, boys. You punch out now. You leave those sailors naked down there." He glanced to his wing. Ensign Ruiz, barely 21, nodded. "With you all the way, Red." They dove together. The air was filled with chaos, tracer lines, smoke, fragments of aircraft tumbling through clouds. Then came a strange moment of silence. Harrison saw 10 flying level at his altitude, canopy open. The Japanese pilot looked at him, not with hatred but calm resignation. He raised one hand. The Zero peeled down sharply toward the fleet. "No," Harrison roared, diving after him. He fired, missed, fired again. The rounds finally struck home, shredding the Zero's tail. It disintegrated mid-dive, the pilot's body vanishing in the explosion. The Hellcat pulled up violently, wings creaking. Harrison's breath came ragged. Ruiz's voice crackled through the radio. "You okay, sir?" "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I'm okay." But his hands were trembling. That night, after landing back aboard, Harrison walked to the railing. The ocean shimmered black under a sliver of moonlight. Commander Reynolds stood beside him, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. "You did good today." "Feels wrong calling it good," Harrison said. "We shot them down, but they didn't even try to live." Reynolds nodded slowly. "They think dying for their emperor is victory, but we can't think that way. We've got to live to win." The next morning, reports came in: 16 ships hit, 7 sunk, hundreds of sailors dead. And still the Japanese kept coming. But the CAP system held. Day by day, American pilots learned to intercept faster, higher, and smarter. They built a living wall of airplanes, one that blunted the suicide storm before it could consume the fleet. By May, the enemy attack slowed. The skies grew clearer, but the memory of those kamikazes, the flash of wings diving from the sun, would haunt every man who saw them. In the CIC, Ensign Collins looked at the empty radar screen and exhaled for the first time in days. "Maybe that's it," he murmured. A radar technician smirked. "You said that yesterday." Collins smiled faintly. "Yeah, but one of these days I'll be right." Outside, the Pacific rolled calm and endless. The battle had turned, but the war and the storm were far from over. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a pale dawn haze, calm, deceptive, indifferent to the war raging above it. Yet beneath the steady hum of carrier decks and the chatter of pilots preparing for launch, another war was being fought, silent, unseen, and just as deadly. This was the realm of the combat information centers, the radar rooms, and the radio networks that linked an empire of ships into a single living organism. The men who fought this battle didn't wear flight jackets or parachutes. They wore headphones, squinted at glowing cathode screens, and guided fighter squadrons into invisible duels miles away. They called it the network that never slept, and without it, every American carrier in the Pacific would have been ash and twisted steel. April 20, 1945, USS Bunker Hill, Combat Information Center, CIC. Ensign Jerry Collins had been awake for 20 hours straight. His voice was hoarse from calling vectors. The air in the CIC was thick with cigarette smoke and the buzz of electric equipment. The room was lit only by the glow of radar scopes and plotting boards, green and ghostly, like the inside of a submarine. "Contact bearing 095, distance 40 miles, Angel 6, he said, eyes locked on the blips. "They're coming in low. Could be another kamikaze pack." A voice came back through his headset, rough and impatient. "Control, this is Red Squadron, ready for vector." "Red Leader, come to heading 110, climb to Angels 12, Collins replied. "Speed full military. You've got company inbound, 50 knots closing." He glanced at the big plexiglass plotting board where grease pencils traced the position of every plane, American and enemy alike. To his right, Lieutenant Ann Ford, one of the Navy's few female radar officers, leaned over the table, marking movements in quick, precise lines. "Second contact forming to the south," she said. "Smaller formation, maybe decoys." Collins frowned. "Or maybe the real strike's hiding behind them." Ford smirked faintly. "You're getting paranoid, Jerry." He shook his head. "I call it experience." Moments later, the blips multiplied, first 10, then 20, then 30. Collins' stomach tightened. "Scratch that, they're not decoys, they're the main wave." The room came alive. Men barked orders, telephones rang, and the ship's radar hummed under strain. Fighter directors relayed vectors to pilots like conductors leading an orchestra. "Launch the reserve CAP," said the senior officer. "Get every bird we've got in the air. We're not letting them through." Above the clouds, Lieutenant Red Harrison and his Hellcat squadron climbed fast, engines howling. The horizon ahead flickered with sunlight on metal dots growing larger by the second. "Control, we've got visuals," he radioed. 20 plus, possibly 30 bogies, all zeros, they're coming in tight formation. From the bunker hill, Collins' voice came steady. "Copy, Red Leader. You are weapons free." "Roger that." Harrison pushed the throttle full forward. "Let's give them a warm welcome, boys." The Hellcats broke formation and dove like hawks. Tracers lanced through the morning sky. Explosions blossomed between the clouds, smoke, debris, a streaking wing tumbling into the sea. Collins could hear the chatter of their radios, voices sharp, overlapping, strained. "Got one. 2 more on my 6, break right." Each call meant lives in motion, men he couldn't see but felt responsible for. Every vector he called could save or kill someone. Then came a new sound, a faint echo on the radar, small but fast, cutting under the others. Collins leaned closer. "Hold up, what's this?" Ford looked up. "Another contact." "Yeah," he said slowly, "but this one's not flying to the fleet, it's flying around it." They tracked it for a minute, then 2. The course made no sense. The blip wasn't attacking, it was observing. Ford's voice was quiet. "A recon plane." Collins nodded grimly. "They're learning, testing our radar range. They'll send the real wave from another angle next time." Elsewhere in the Pacific, USS Enterprise. On the Enterprise, Commander Will Iron Douglas, head of radar operations, was facing the same pattern. Blips disappearing, reappearing from unexpected bearings. He slammed his fist against the console. "They've figured out our picket ship's gaps. Those kamikazes are diving through blind spots." An ensign nearby hesitated. "Should we move the pickets closer, sir?" Douglas shook his head. "Closer, and they'll be sunk before they can warn us. We need overlapping radar coverage. Get Task Group 58.4 on a new circuit. I want real-time data, not this 10-minute delay garbage." The young ensign saluted and ran off. Douglas exhaled and muttered to himself, "Goddamn smart bastards." For all their desperation, the Japanese were adapting, using low-altitude approaches, false returns, even cloud cover to mask their attacks. The CAP network had to evolve just as fast. Back on the bunker hill, nightfall. It was 2300 hours. The sea was black glass, the ships running dark to avoid detection. Collins sat slumped in his chair, eyes bloodshot, when the radio crackled again. "Control, this is Picket Station, Baker. Multiple echoes coming from bearing 215. Low and fast, looks like." The transmission cut off. "Baker, repeat," Collins said, leaning forward. "Baker, come in." Silence. Then faintly, "Hit, fire on deck, going down." Static swallowed the rest. Ford's voice was barely a whisper. "That was one of ours." Collins stared at the dead channel. "They took out a radar ship. They're hitting our eyes." Within minutes, the fleet's communication board lit up, relays, updates, emergency calls. Another picket reported smoke on the horizon. A destroyer began transmitting last coordinates. The Japanese weren't aiming for carriers anymore. They were targeting the system itself, the picket destroyers, the radar buoys, the link nodes that held the CAP together. Collins clenched his jaw. "They're trying to blind us before they hit again." Ford looked up at him. "Then we don't let them." The improvised fix. The next morning, Collins and Ford worked side by side with ship engineers, improvising new communication circuits using spare radio parts. They rerouted radar feeds through auxiliary lines, creating overlapping coverage zones, messy, inefficient but functional. "We'll call it grid echo," Collins said. "Every ship reports in 90-second intervals. If one goes dark, the others fill the blind spot." Ford grinned. "That's crazy." He smiled back. "Crazy works." By afternoon, the new grid was running. Data streamed in a rhythmic pulse across the fleet. For the first time in weeks, They had redundancy, the beginnings of what would later become the Navy's tactical air control network. That night, when another kamikaze wave came, the CAP intercepted before the ships even went to general quarters. The sky above Okinawa blazed again, but this time the Americans were ready. A quiet dawn. The morning after, the ocean was strangely still. Smoke drifted across a pale orange sky. Collins and Ford stood on deck, watching a Hellcat glide in for landing. The pilot climbed out, face streaked with oil and exhaustion. "Good call on those vectors, Control," he said quietly. "You probably saved my life." Collins just nodded, glad it worked. When the pilot walked off, Ford looked at him. "You know," she said softly, "no one outside this room will ever know what we did." Collins smiled faintly. "That's fine, we weren't in it for the glory." He looked back toward the horizon, where sunlight broke through the clouds. "We just wanted everyone else to make it home." Epilogue: The network lives. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the U.S. Navy's radar and CAP coordination network had evolved into the most advanced combat system of the war. What began as a chaotic patchwork of radios and radar scopes had become a living defense web that could detect, track, and destroy enemy planes hundreds of miles away. Historians would later call it the first modern example of real-time air defense networking, the foundation for systems that would define warfare for decades to come. But for the men who lived it, Collins, Ford, Harrison, and thousands of others, it wasn't about history. It was about survival and the belief that even in chaos, communication could hold back the storm. By May 1945, the Pacific had turned into a floating graveyard of twisted steel and drifting smoke. Yet amid that ruin, the U.S. fleet stood stronger than ever. The Combat Air Patrol Network, born out of chaos, refined through blood, now blanketed the ocean like an invisible web. Each blip on a radar scope, each squawk of a radio transmission, was a heartbeat in a vast organism fighting for survival. But even as the system matured into perfection, everyone aboard knew something darker was coming, the final wave. The Japanese Empire, cornered, humiliated, and desperate, had stripped its skis bare to unleash one last, all-or-nothing assault. On May 25, hundreds of pilots, barely trained boys, were told their death would be the Emperor's salvation. They took off in battered Zeros and Oka rocket bombs, clutching farewell letters and photographs of families they'd never see again. Across the sea, aboard the USS Enterprise, Commander Will Iron Douglas watched the radar screen light up like a Christmas tree of death. "They're coming," he said simply, his voice flat. The CIC went silent except for the hum of equipment. All squadrons launch everything. And in that instant, every deck erupted with life. Flight crews shouted, engines roared, propellers blurred into silver halos. Dozens of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers thundered into the air, lifting off into a sky already heavy with incoming death. Above the fleet, Lieutenant Red Harrison led his CAP group into the blinding sunlight. His eyes narrowed as his radar detector pinged. Multiple bogies bearing 085 Angels 8 closing fast. Then came the shimmer, tiny black dots against the glow growing larger. "Visual confirmed," he radioed calmly. "Looks like at least 40. Kamikazes, this is it, boys." He didn't need to say more, they all knew. The chatter over the net was strangely quiet, just breathing and clipped acknowledgments. And then it began, the final sky battle of the Pacific. The Hellcats plunged first, diving out of the sun, .50 caliber guns blazing. The sky turned into a web of tracer lines, arcs of smoke, and explosions that flashed white against the blue. A Zero disintegrated midair, another caught fire and spun down like a falling comet. But for every one destroyed, another broke through. On the decks below, anti-aircraft guns roared to life, 5-inch cannons thundering, Bofors guns barking, flak bursting in black puffs. The sea boiled with spent shells and burning wreckage. The Enterprise shook under the concussions. On radar, Douglas saw blips disappearing, friend and foe alike. "CIC, we've got one diving straight down," yelled a spotter. The ship's loudspeaker blared, "Brace for impact." Everyone ducked. The kamikaze, a white Zero trailing smoke, screamed toward the flight deck, hit by a burst at the last second, exploding just yards above the surface. The shockwave threw sailors off their feet, fire washing across the deck, but the ship still floated. "Damage control, forward section," Douglas shouted, already relaying new vectors. There was no time to pause. The network had to stay alive, even if everything else burned. Across the fleet, the CAP squadrons fought like men possessed. Pilots chased kamikazes in head-on collisions. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed. One destroyer, the USS Laffey, took 5 direct hits and kept firing, its radar still transmitting coordinates to guide interceptors. "Keep the grid online," Douglas barked into his mic. "If we lose the feed, we lose the fleet." His team worked through smoke and chaos, switching power lines, reconnecting broken circuits. Their faces lit by the eerie green of the radar glow, and somehow, through sheer defiance, the network held. The radar pulses didn't stop. The radio vectors kept flowing. Hours passed like minutes. The sea was littered with oil slicks and burning debris. The sky, once bright, was now a patchwork of smoke trails and flames. Harrison's squadron was down to half strength. "Control, we're running low on ammo," he said over the radio, panting, "but we're still flying." Collins' voice came faint and steady from the Bunker Hills CIC. "You've done enough, Red. We've got the rest." Harrison laughed, a short, exhausted sound. "Not yet. Not till the sky's clean." He banked hard, chased one last kamikaze plunging toward a destroyer, lined it up perfectly, and fired. The enemy plane erupted mid-dive, scattering flaming metal across the waves. "Splash one," he whispered, before turning back toward the fleet, the ocean below him glowing red from the fires. By dusk it was over. The last radar echoes faded, leaving only static. The sky was empty except for smoke and drifting parachutes. In the CIC, Douglas leaned on the plotting table, hands trembling. "Report," he murmured. "Total losses." A young officer read from a notepad, voice breaking. 3 destroyers sunk, 2 carriers hit, 12 fighters down, but the main line intact. The network held, sir." Douglas closed his eyes. Then it was worth it. On the flight deck above, sailors walked among the wreckage, bent propellers, twisted wings, shell casings knee-deep. Some sat down and cried. Others just stared at the horizon, too tired to feel anything. As night fell, a strange quiet settled over the fleet. The ocean glowed faintly with burning fuel. The only sounds were the distant crackle of fires and the rhythmic pulse of radar still sweeping the skies. Collins stood beside Ford, both silent. She finally spoke. "It's over, isn't it?" He hesitated. "I think so." But he didn't sound sure. They both knew Japan still stood, battered, cornered, but not yet broken. And somewhere out there, beyond the radar's reach, others were waiting for orders that would never come. A week later, the Combat Air Patrol Network was running at reduced readiness. The kamikazes never returned in force. Japan's fuel reserves were gone. The Empire's airfields were smoking craters. The radar screens, once alive with movement, now showed only empty seas. Douglas sent his last operational report to Admiral Spruance. "Enemy air power neutralized. Fleet secure. Recommend full post-action commendations to all radar and communication personnel. They saved the fleet." Then he took off his headset and finally allowed himself to breathe. When the war ended months later, the official reports credited the victory at Okinawa to overwhelming American firepower and courage, but buried in the appendices was a small note. Success of the Combat Air Patrol Network was decisive in mitigating kamikaze damage. No names, no pictures, just a line in history. Years later, in a small veterans hall in Kansas, an older Jerry Collins, his hair silver, now stood by a display case showing a faded radar scope and a brass nameplate from the Bunker Hill. A young boy asked, "Did you fly, sir?" Collins smiled. "No, I helped the ones who did find their way home." He looked out the window where sunlight poured across a quiet sky, so clean, so still, and whispered to himself, "We never slept so they could wake up to peace." The Pacific had gone silent at last. But in that silence lived the hum of 1,000 radars that once beat like a living heart, holding back the storm. And though the men who built it faded away, their invisible web of courage and code would outlive them all, reborn in every system that ever kept watch over a sky. And somewhere, over those same waters where smoke once rose, the waves still carried faint echoes of static, like the pulse of a ghost network that refused to die.